Thank you, Pajwal. Namaskar. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupine avatara varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Sruti smriti purananam alayam karunalayam namami bhagavat padam shankaram lokashankaram. See, we are beginning this session. We are continuing with Brahma Sutras. As I mentioned during the early sessions, it is a very profound and one of the most important and foundational texts in Advaita philosophy. But this text also discusses some very interesting points that could be of great enthusiasm and interest for modern people. For example, this question of reincarnation, rebirth, how it happens. And some of these views seem to be very, very rational and quite logical. So that's what we are going to discuss today, taking one important sutra, not one from the early part. I mean, it's called the Chadasutri, the 4 important sutras. We'd already discussed Adhado Jignasa, Janmadishyataha, Shastrayonitva, Tattva Samannaya. We discussed this. Today we are going to discuss something very interesting, not entirely, not completely linked to Advaita metaphysics, but part of the discussion. How do we migrate to another body when we die? The subject is discussed in the Bhagavad Gita, and in many other scriptures it is discussed, but we are trying to discuss this in the light of the Brahma Sutras. How do we migrate to another body? And when we are reborn, do we carry with us our tendencies and impressions and feelings and accumulators, what we call samskaras, impressions? Or are we born with an empty slate, in a tabula rasa, in John Locke's theory? So this is being discussed in a very important sutra. So that's what we are going to discuss. Now, this question is important because we often cannot give a definite answer for some of our obsessions, views, the diversity of temperaments of children in the same family, of the same parentage, same education, and the products of the same circumstances still are totally different. So how do we find a proper answer to this mystery? So of course, we all know from different sources that one important proof that is mentioned in many of their books is that when we associate with certain persons and when we associate with certain places, when we connect with certain ideas, and if you feel a kind of, well, I'm familiar with this place, so I'm familiar with these ideas. A child prodigy who is interested in music from his or her infancy, I mean, prodigious skills, which it's so mind-boggling, we cannot really find an answer. Like that, some strong likes and dislikes, extremely monstrous human characters, extremely saintly human characters. So how do we find an explanation to this? This is being discussed in a very interesting sutra, and I shall try to explain this in the light of Shankaracharya's commentary. So it begins like this. For example, the sutra, in fact, those who are interested, there are English translations available. You need not necessarily know Sanskrit to understand the running theme of the discussion in this translation. It's called 3rd chapter, 1st quarter. It's called the 1st pada, Prathama pada, Tritiya adhyaya. And the 1st sutra. You can, if you can note down, you can easily. First, pada means every chapter has 4 quarters. So Brahma Sutra has got 555 sutras divided into 4 chapters. Each chapter containing different units, each unit having different sutras. Frequently one sutra, maybe sometimes many sutras under one unit called Adhikaranam, which I discussed earlier. And this particular sutra which we are going to discuss today, it comes in the 3rd chapter, 1st quarter, 1st sutra. Sutra is the Piti statement. You can see English translation. So the sutra is this Tadandara Pradipatti Adhikaranam. It discusses one important sutra. It's called Tadandara Pradipatto Ramkhadi Samparishuktaha Prasna Nirupanabhyam. This is the sutra. It looks a bit like a garland. No? Tadandara Pradipatto Ramkhadi Samparishuktaha Prasna Nirupanabhyam. Tadandara Pradipatto means, Andra means another body. When a soul, after death, when it migrates to another body, then does the soul carry with him all the tendencies and impressions accumulated in this life, or does it migrate without the accompaniment of these characteristics? This is the central theme. Now, Brahma Sutra's method is, it discusses this by analyzing the subject from different angles, from different philosophical angles. According to Shankaracharya, who believes in Advaita, and according to Advaita philosophy, every soul called Jiva, individual soul, I mean individual soul, Jiva, when it migrates to another body, when it is going for a reincarnation or rebirth, it is accompanied by all the samskaras, impressions, vrittis, tendencies, all accumulated in this life. Only it gets a new body, that's all. You may ask this question. Suppose you have read a lot of books on, let's say, Advaita or mysticism, Christian mysticism in this life. You have done a lot of meditation and so on. And you did all this with this present body in this life, using your eyes, your ears, and your mind that is associated with this body. And when you lose this body at the time of death, how can you carry with you the impressions that you gathered using these eyes, these ears? You listen to a lot of Vedanta, a lot of spiritual ideas, and your temperament, tendencies are being shaped by what you heard, what you listened to, what you contemplate on. And so you accumulated a lot of spiritual characteristics. But all with this body and the senses associated with this body. Senses mean indriyani, karmendriyani, jnanendriyani. Senses of perception, senses of action, and mind, all associated with this body-mind complex. This body-mind complex is pushed to the tube, because when you become 100 years old, everyone has to do that, has to undergo this process. When the body is pushed to the tube, along with that body, these eyes also go away. So when you're born again, how can you carry with you the tendencies accumulated in this life using these 2 pair of eyes? This is the question. The answer is this. The senses may disappear. Eyes are destroyed with the body. Ears are destroyed with the body. The mind is not destroyed. So mind here doesn't have anything to do with the so-called heart that a doctor may be familiar with. It is absolutely different from what you call heart. It is a mechanism which is called antakarana, which has got 4 faculties, 4 compartments. One compartment sees things and recognizes and speculates. Another compartment decide the rative faculty. So speculative faculty called mind, decide-rative faculty called intellect or buddhi, and then another compartment of this mental system called antakarana, which is called, which actually chittam. The chittam accommodates or accumulates all the tendencies, samskara, memories. And of course, then the self-identification. So if you see an object in front of you, you may mistake a pillar for a human being. You are speculating, it is mind, mana, it's called in Sanskrit. You come to a conclusion as to what it is. Intellect, buddhi decides it is not a pillar, but it's a human being, or maybe the vice versa. And then you remember, because you've seen, it is something that you have seen in previous, maybe the last week. So your own ego, ahankara, and then the memory comes forward and you're able to recognize it. So now this mechanism, it accompanies you when you are born again. This mechanism is not a physical entity. It doesn't require it is not dependent upon the body, but it cannot express itself without a physical body, with the senses. You may have tendencies, but to manifest those tendencies, and to express those tendencies, to make use of those tendencies, you need eyes, ears, and so on. But these tendencies are themselves accumulated in the mental system. It's called antakaranam. It's called the sukshma sariram, sthula sariram, karana sariram. Karana sarira is a subtle body. It means the real personality, for example. To give an example, a man like Gandhi, the physical body, that's not what you think of. When you think of Gandhi, you think of non-violence and great ideas like that. When you think of Lincoln, you think of his sacrifice, his idealism, and so on. So the physical structure is important, but behind that, you associate that physical structure with something, what he stood for, what he believed, what he identified with. Any great man, that sukshma shariram, called subtle. It is not body, it is a real character, which contains tendencies, impressions, memories, and so on. So sthula shariram is called gross body, the physical body, which of course disappears when a person dies. But this subtle body, the mental world, the mental structure, it remains intact. It comes along with you when you are born as a child. Now, these tendencies do not necessarily begin to manifest when you are an infant. It may, some of the early tendencies may begin to manifest only in certain stages in our life. You must have been a great mystic in the past, a great contemplative mystic. So in this life, perhaps you must be born as a businessman, fully involved in worldly things, worldly activities, making money. But then suddenly you get a jolt, a shock. Immediately mind turns to something higher. And you realize there is something beyond wealth. So that ability to immediately realize, to be awakened by a shocking experience, that comes because you have already accumulated a lot of spiritual tendencies in the past. And when something happens in this life, those tendencies suddenly sprang forth, they surfaced, and they begin to man. A man like Ramana Maharshi was a great sage who lived in South India. in the first half of 20th century. Now, his father died. He was studying in a Christian missionary school. I mean, I had some spiritual discipline, we don't know, just like the everyday routine, not beyond that. But his father's death made him think. And finally, he left his home, came to Tiruvannamalai, went to the temple maybe a few times, then retired to a cave, stayed there and meditated and became Ramana Maharshi. So you can imagine the shocking experience of the demise of the father. It doesn't turn every person into a saint. But in his case, it happened. Because that shocking experience suddenly brought the higher tendencies, samskaras from the lower layers of the mental lake. They came forward and this happened. So the discussion here, yatha karma, yatha sudam, according to the karmas one has done in previous life, and accordingly this happens. So I mentioned earlier, there are two views, the prima facie view, Purva Paksha. Paksha means a standpoint. Purva means something that strikes you at the first reading. So the prima facie, in its Latin expression, may not carry the same implication which the word Purva Paksha carries in Sanskrit in Vedantic dialectical books. But still, that is a standard translation, for want of a better term. So the prima facie view, I mean, somebody may read it. Well, this is what I feel about it. This is what I understand. So the Purva Paksha, or what you call it, objection or objector's view, that's how it may be given in English translations. I don't normally read a lot of translations like that. So, but I found that objection or objector's view or prima facie view, that's right, is given, is maybe this view was held by ritualistic philosophers and Sankhya philosophers and so on. They had the opinion that, of course, you carry with you the mind, which means speculative faculties, but you don't carry all the tendencies and impressions from previous life. So they often quote an important verse from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Athaina mede prana abhisamayanti saeta tejo matra samabhyadadana. Like they quote this particular verse, mantra from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It means only senses and mind in their subtle form accompany the jiva when it's reborn. The tendencies and impressions and characteristics do not normally accompany. This is the prima facie view. Because Siddhanta Paksha means the Advaitins' view is no. They are accompanied by all the tendencies and impressions and samskaras when you are reborn. That's where remember when you read, it's very interesting because it's not pure philosophy, but it's linked to many other Vedic mantras in different scriptures. It's called Tadantar Pradivatu Remkadi Samparishaptaka Prasnirupnapyam. Tadantar Privatu Dehantar Pradivatu Remkadi Gechadi. Like the Shankaracharya writes in commentary, which I will discuss later. Now, next subject is when you are reborn, how do your temperaments and characteristics decide or shape the type of families, the type of circumstances in which you are born again in this new life? There are some important mantras in the Bhagavad Gita, which I will discuss in the next session. It comes in the 6th chapter. Lord Krishna says, Purvabhyasena tenaiva Hridevi avashopi saha jignasuhu abhiyogasya shabda brahmadi vartade. By the force of previous acquaintance, by the force of previously accumulated samskaras and impressions, which force you and you are helpless. Avasha means you are helpless. You are pushed forward by the force of your own past samskaras. And then if you have done a lot of great things in the past, you cannot help being a good person. Unfortunately, the opposite also is true. And then Lord Krishna says in the 6th chapter, Tatradam buddhi samyogam labhade paurodekikam. There in this new life, the samskaras and impressions and vasanas and tendencies, all the attitudes and the aptitudes that you have accumulated in your previous life, they connect with similar or identical circumstances. Buddhi samyoga. Buddhi here means wrote antakarana. And then you continue your spiritual journey and go forward, go onward. So a child may not immediately manifest all the samskaras, all the impressions, all tendencies coming from previous life. You may or may not. But sometimes, in many cases, as we find in Ramana Maharshi's case, you have to wait for some years for a tragedy which may not be interpreted as a very big tragedy by a normal person, death of a father. It's certainly very unfortunately very sad, but it may not have a transformative impact on every person. It may not turn him into an Aristotle necessarily or a Socrates. But in Ramana Maharshi's case, that was enough for him to turn his mind in another direction, and he became the great saint that he later became. And in this context, in fact, if you look at the sutra itself, if you got the book, there's one word. Tantarparivatto means when you leave your body behind and when you attain a new body. Ramkadi means going in search, going forward in search of a new body. Samparishuktaha means accompanied or joined by, accompanied by. The question arises, how do you prove it? So that sutra, one part, the last part of the sutra, tells you as to how to prove this. And it is proved with the help of one important quotation from the Chandogya Upanishad. That quotation it comes in the 5th chapter of Chandogya Upanishad. It is called 5th chapter, 4th khanda. It's a very interesting discussion. Aso avaloka gaudamaknihi tasya adityeva samita. That goes a long discussion, one after another. One after the five Panjak, it's called Panjakni Vidya. The science of the five principles. A rough translation. The science, the spiritual science of explaining the mystery of transmigration of a soul from one body to another in the form of a dialogue that takes place between a sage with the name Gautama, and remember, the teacher is a king, is a monarch, Panchala. Panchala, you are the king of a kingdom which includes today's East Punjab and also a large portion of Pakistan. So the king who, Pravahana, the king who teaches this great science of transmigration to a sage. The king is teaching to sage. He was the king of Panchala. Panchala was a kingdom which included today's some portions of India's northwestern border, like Haryana and Punjab, and also a large portion of today's Pakistan. It's called Panchala, the kingdom of Panchala. So he's the one who teaches this great science to Gautama Rishi. Now that instruction begins like this. It's a very Aso avaloka Gautamaknihi tasya adityeva samid resmayo dhumaha ahararchihi chandrama angaraha nakshatrani vispulingaha. Like that goes on. Of course, I can discuss this when we take up Chandogya Upanishad at that time. Now we'll come to Shankaracharya's commentary, because it may not be proper to leave out Shankara's magical explanation of this mystery. So if you look at the Brahma Sutra, you find at the beginning itself, the subject is presented in a very interesting way by presenting the possible objection and also the answer to that objection. The objection comes from a non-Advaitic philosopher generally, and the answer comes from Advaita himself, Advaita himself. So aveshtido va bhuta sukshmaihi puman brajed bhudanam sulabhatvena yat aveshtida evasa bijanam durlabhatvena niradharindriya gatehi panchamahudi yuktescha jivastai yadi veshtidaka. So this is this sloka. I just want to read this interesting, then only I will be able to do justice. So it explains the idea that the discussion is around the subject of transmigration, and whether a person is born accompanied by all his previous tendencies and impressions gathered in all his previous incarnations in life, or is he born, as you know, as I mentioned, John Locke's theory, tabula rasa, as empty table, empty slate, empty table theory, which is now practically rejected by most educationists. John Locke had a great influence on some of the early educational philosophers, especially in the Western world. It's still important, but the tabula rasa theory seems to be now on the way out. At least many don't accept. There are, of course, many who may accept it. That's a different thing. So now we will come to the interesting subject. So Shankaracharya says, Kim tavat praptam asamparishukta iti. So here the objective's view is presented, and objective's arguments for his view is presented. And then Shankaracharya replies, Tadandar privattu dehantar privattu deha bijaihi bhuta sukshmaihi samparishuktaha remkadi gechadi iti avagantavyam kutaha prasna nirupanabhyam. So this is the technique used in the Brahma Sutra. You have to find a source, and the source should be from Upanishads, or Upanishads constitute the first primary source, or maybe from Bhagavad Gita. But the emphasis was always to establish the theory of Advaita. In this context, the theory that every person is accompanied by his own accumulated tendencies and impressions when he migrates to a new body. And the reason given is, otherwise you cannot explain the diversity of human temperaments and human characteristics belonging to the same genetic parentage, same circumstances. So 5 children in a family of same parents, same school, same education, identical circumstances, but as they grow up in different stages, they show up, they begin to manifest very diverse taste and temperaments and attitudes, and their idealisms, the values, and so on. That's because each person is an individual, lonely traveler in this journey of life. We may be part of a family in one life cycle, part of another family in previous life cycle, and still another family in the next life cycle. So when you keep in mind the diversity, that also explains the mystery that there should be one jiva, one individual soul, who goes through so many life cycles. And that individual soul accumulates so many experiences, good and bad. One telling example for this is found in a different book, Bhagavata Purana. Shankaracharya doesn't quote from Bhagavata Purana. He doesn't even refer to Bhagavata Purana. In fact, there was no book that he had not read or referred to. So the very fact that Shankaracharya did not ever refer to Bhagavata Purana is a proof, according to scholars, that Bhagavata Purana, as we find today, did not exist in his time. Otherwise, that book won't escape his attention. That was so prodigious was his scholarship. So he says, Kutaha, how do we know this? So he refers Prasthanirupanabhyam, question and answer, the debates and discussion dialogue between King Pravahana, Panchala, King Pravahana, and Gautama, the saint. So the idea is linked to the establishing, the way of establishing the Advaitic view is done on the basis of some important quotations from the Upanishads. Why Upanishads? According to India's metaphysical tradition, as I mentioned earlier in early sessions, whenever you have to prove that one view is to be upheld and another view is to be ignored, discarded, what's the criterion? How do you come to judge the validity, the authenticity of the view that you uphold and the non-authenticity of the view that you discard, based on whether it is found in the Upanishads or not? This is an important thing. You know, it is a very, very far-reaching idea. I can give examples. You may, those of you who read India's history, Indian sociology, Indian political situations, and so on, you must have heard of the casteism, many social injustices which existed in Indian Hindu society for some time. Maybe not so much now. It's constitutionally wrong. It's a criminal offense to practice it in today's condition, according to Indian Penal Code. But in many villages, it did exist for some centuries. It's an ancient civilization. But it has no sanction for the Upanishads or Vedas. Because, so it is invalid, it is wrong. So when Gandhi came to one place in India, one South Indian temple, Vaikam is called, Shiva temple, where the king wanted to, where the early days, they were not allowed to go to the temple. Gandhi brought some great pandits and established the fact that this has no sanction in the Upanishads. So there is Sudis Mudi Purananam Virodho Yetra Drusyade Tatra Sraudam Pramanam Syat Ayodhaithe Smridvara. This is statement from Vyasa. The same Vyasa who wrote Brahma Sutra, he also says, whenever there is a conflict between what the Upanishads say, what the Puranas and the Indian codes, Smridis say, you have to uphold what the Vedas or Upanishads teach, discard the statements of other scriptures. So the Upanishads are presenting before you the ideal of a universal spiritual unity and oneness of existence. So this Mudi Virodeshu Sridireva Gariyasi Virodetu Sadakarim Smatam Vaidyosada. I'm coming Jabala Smriti, another ancient constitution. When there's a conflict, you have to uphold the views of Upanishads. So Shankaracharya brings that statement. So he says, Prasthanirupanabhyam, Veta Yatha Panchamya Mahuda Vapa Purusha Vajaso Bhavanti. Each come Chandogya Upanishad quotes. Iditu Panchamya Mahuda Vapa Purusha Vajaso. The key quotes. What I mean to say, the fact that a person who migrates to another body doesn't go alone. He migrates with a huge bundle, and that bundle contains all his tendencies and samskaras, which will manifest in different stages in his next life. depending upon the circumstances, as we found in the example of Ramana Maharshi. This is an important thing to remember. So in the Bhagavad Gita, discussing this subject, Lord Krishna says, those who have practiced asceticism, renunciation, is a man like Buddha, Christ, Gandhi, or Shankaracharya, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, great men, great saints, let's say, who have led a life of purity, asceticism, and spiritual discipline, completely dedicated to spiritual practices. If they don't succeed in attaining the highest spiritual attainment or enlightenment in this life, and if they die, and when they migrate to another body, they'll be born in a family where the parents also will be ascetics. The parents also will have these traditional spiritual values, so that jiva, that individual soul, will find himself in a family born to such a mother and father, where he will be automatically forced to continue his spiritual progress in the next life. Everything will be conducive. And then he won't be able to strike a new path. Even if he wants to do something wrong, he won't be able to do that. That's the force of inherited tendencies and samskara. Suchinam simadam geke yoga brashto vijayade. Another category is mentioned in this verse. Suppose one person, he worked hard, he led a good life, practicing some spiritual disciplines, but not much given to asceticism or anything. He wants to enjoy this life. He wants to get a good job, make a lot of money, maybe a high job, and perhaps he didn't attain that, but he led a good life. Such a person, when he's born, he'll be born in a family, maybe his parents will be big businessmen, he will get a good education, MBA or something, and he will easily get a good job as a CEO of a big company. Why? Because he has earned that much. He belongs to another level of spiritual evolution. It's a continuing evolution. That's an important thing. It's a continuing evolution. Nobody is inferior or superior. His friend, who didn't care for anything other than spiritual disciplines, who practiced renunciation and asceticism, he did not have any desire yet to be fulfilled in this life. He'll be born in a family where he'll be able to continue his spiritual disciplines. He may be born as a son or daughter of some great spiritual mystics and so on like that. Now, the force of this idea of transmigration can be found throughout our Indian mythological literature. I mentioned this on one occasion. In the Bhagavata Purana itself, there is a story of a king. It's a classic example. Sometimes when we look around, observe our friends, and analyze our own life, how circumstances, how external circumstances impact on our own views and have some transformative effect or impact on our own decision making, our choices in life. You can see, how did I escape this great teaching or this great ideal till now? And how is it that I am attracted to this great teaching all of a sudden? There is no real mystery. It's a very logical explanation. You have earned that. So I can give another example. I'm going to discuss this story from Bhagavata Purana. Before that, suppose you're a school teacher and you are explaining a mathematical formula or something in a classroom, and you find that among all the 100 students in your class, one student suddenly demonstrates a unique skill in immediately understanding and interpreting what you're teaching, when of course he's hearing for the first time. If his parents are teachers, he may have heard from his parents, but there's no clue that he must have heard, because his parents may be totally different person, not the kind of people who teach him this mathematical formula before he comes to the class. But he captures this. This is also music, art, painting, and so on. So when he hears, it's almost like a revision for him. Why? There is some Parishoktaka, that's in the sutra, says he's accompanied when he's born again. He's accompanied by the memories and tendencies, and the attitudes and the aptitudes and characteristics of all his previous accumulated impressions. And they are transferred to a new body. This could happen, of course, when children demonstrate that, immediately we understand. But this need not necessarily manifest when they're children, may manifest in their old age also. Here, example, how it happens in the old age. The opposite also is true. Old memories can come and drag you down unless we are careful. Old tendencies can also have a destructive effect sometimes. So there was a king, his name was Bharata. So he was a big emperor, a wonderful philosopher king, so to speak. And when he became too old, he decided to spend the rest of his lifetime on the banks of a holy river, Ganga or Kali, India, Yamuna, one of some of these rivers in India. There's an ancient tradition in India when an householder, whether he's a king or emperor or an ordinary person, when he finds that he's growing gray hair is getting gray, or his face is getting wrinkled, then he should retire to a place of contemplation and spend his lifetime immersed in some kind of a spiritual discipline contemplation. Grihastastu yada pasyed vali palidam atmanaha apatyasya apatyam tada aranyam samasayed. Grihastastu yada pasyed. When a grihastha, when an householder sees his hair is getting gray and his face is getting wrinkled, and he also sees the face of his grandchildren, grandson or granddaughter, then he should retire to a contemplative place. That's the idea behind. So the king was practicing that ancient discipline, ancient tradition, convention. So he retired from his palace, went to a holy river, sat there for meditation. So remember, he was a great king, he renounced his kingdom, his comforts, his luxury, everything. His own children, grandchildren, all. Now, one day it so happened that a deer was being chased by a lion. The deer was pregnant. And as the deer jumped over a stream, that female deer was pregnant. It gave birth to a little child, and he died in the process. So the little deer child was born, just newborn child. It was being carried away by the strong currents in the river stream, and the king jumped and rescued the deer, the little one, and it began to grow in his hermitage for long years. So what happened, he forgot the very purpose of coming over there. He forgot that he had his own children, grandchildren, and others in his own palace, in his own family. He has renounced all of them because he wanted to spend the last few years in contemplation, in meditation, contemplating on God, or reading scriptures. That he forgot. Instead, he began to think only about this deer, the animal. Now, if he was a highly enlightened person, he would certainly have rescued that deer, no doubt. But he would have, of course, taken care of the little animal, but he would also be able to practice some degree of non-attachment. He will not deviate from his life of ascetic practices and completely forgot the very purpose of his coming to the monastery, to the hermitage, and became involved, he completely forgot to do japa, meditation. He began to take care of this animal. Certainly an act of compassion, but if you are a spiritual seeker, he should do that. The act of compassion is an integral part of all spiritual seekers, but he should also be able to practice discerning wisdom and a degree of non-attachment, even while taking care of the little animal. He did not do that. So what happened? The last days we were approaching, and one day he was about to die, and the animal came to him, and he was thinking only about the animal. Ante Narayana Smriti, every person should think of God at the last moment. He forgot that. He was thinking about the animal only. And he was born, next life, was born as a deer. But then he was born with all the great qualities that he had accumulated in his previous life. He was a king, his manner of renunciation. And he was a great ascetic. Those good qualities did not leave him, though he was born as a deer. He was born as an animal, but he was born with all the samskaras. Tadantara privatu remkhadi samparishuktaga prasnarupanabhyam. This Brahma Sutra mantra. Means you are born, when you are born, we are accompanied by all the previous samskaras, tendencies. So the animal was a strange animal. It lived the same hermitage where it lived in his previous life, and he won't go out. He won't mix with the other animals because he did not feel at home while mixing with other animals. So he lived there, and he died. In his next life, he was born as a great saint. So he was afraid of associating wrong associations. So he will keep away from everyone. He pretended to be dull, though he was an extremely brilliant person. But he pretended to be dull. He won't socialize with anyone. He was afraid, well, I may again get into trouble, because he remembers the previous life cycles. So you can find such interesting things in Islam. So if you find people sometimes showing extreme tendencies, or if you feel yourself to be disturbed when you find yourself in a very, let's say, unpleasant set of circumstances, we must know it's because our mind is a highly evolved mind. We have earned a lot of spiritual wealth from the past in the form of samskaras, impressions, and tendencies. So if when we want to live a very bohemian way of life, we cannot do. We'll be totally helpless. We'll be imprisoned by our own tendencies, impressions, and samskaras. We will be a prisoner of our own good samskaras and tendencies. So we cannot help doing great things and good things now in this life, because we have reached that point where we cannot go back to early days. Remember, there is also the chance from some distant past, some unfortunate tendencies may emerge and may try to turn our mind away from our main focus. That also can happen, but we should be careful. It's a very interesting sutra. So even Brahma Sutra is not all about metaphysics, dialectics, and polemics. There's also many great ideas are discussed here. Many of the mysteries that we find around ourselves, if we analyze, all these can find some answers in great work. So thank you. We can have interaction. Most welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj. Sri Ram, please proceed.
You mentioned that in the transmigration, the Stula Sharira goes, the Sukshma and the Karana Sharira will move on.
Can you be a little slow and speak a little louder?
You mentioned in the transmigration that the Stula Sharira, gross body perishes, and the Sukshma and the Karana Sharira move on. So the Sukshma Sharira has got the Pancha Jnanendriya, Pancha Karmendriya, Pancha Prana, Manobuddhi Chitta, Ahankara. Can you draw a parallel between this and then the Pancha Kosha of the Taittiriya Upanishad? So the Annamaya Kosha will perish?
Yeah. Annamaya Kosha will perish. Other koshas will survive. Actually the Karana Sharira means it implies our lack of awareness by which we identify ourselves with the physical body. Avidya, ignorance. That's why we identify ourselves with the physical body. That is important. Without that, so we won't identify ourselves with Sukshma Shariras. For normal human beings, Karana Sharira, they are not enlightened. So Karana Sharira is there. And also Samskaras in person. I mentioned to you, in the books you find, they are accompanied by Indriyas. Indriyas, if you look for translation, Indriyas mean the Karmendriyas and Jnanendriyas, the senses of action, senses of perception. Your hands belong to the category of senses of action. Your hands don't accompany you when you're born again.
That is not in the subtle body, they accompany you.
Education is the samskaras and tendencies that you accumulated by using your hands or your ears in this life. They accompany, not the sense, not the indriyas themselves. That's the idea behind. Yeah.
The Anandamaya Kosha would correspond to the Karana Sharira.
Anandamaya Kosha. Anandamaya Kosha is closest to Atman. Okay. It is not Karana Sharira. Anandamaya Kosha is beyond Karana Sharira. It is closest to Atman. Yeah.
What is the correspondence to Karana Sharira in the Panchakoshas? What is corresponding to the Karana Sharira in Panchakoshas?
Actually, this Sthula Shari, the Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha,
Manomaya
Kosha, all these they are the products of Karana Sharira. Without Karana Sharira is avidya. Without that, you won't think yourself, that you won't think that you are not Atman. And without thinking that you are not Atman, you won't have the feeling of identity with the Sharira, with the Indriyas. Okay? Thank you. Now we go to some other friends who may like to ask questions.
Thank you. David, your hand's up next.
Hello, Swami. I wanted to ask you, was that the story that you just told? That was King Bharata?
Yeah, there are two kings mentioned in our books. One is Jadabharata. The other one is a Bharata, the king mentioned in the Ramayana. And of course, so there is another Bharata called in Dushyanta's story. So this king belongs to Bhagavata Purana, which he was a great ascetic. He's a great devotee, a great man of spiritual wisdom. But he made just one small little deviation, but he did not lose anything because he had a brief life as an animal, and he was born again. Sometimes in many of these, in the Puranas, sometimes the mythological books throw light on subjects which may not be clearly explained in the higher metaphysical books. You find in mythological books some children showing extraordinary spiritual wisdom by evolution and living very short life, and for some mysterious reasons they die. The examples that they displayed extraordinary spiritual characteristics, and just because they have only very short distance to travel to complete before reaching their destination, so they are born again. Sometimes you find people in their advanced years suddenly taking a sudden 180 degrees, they turn their face away from what they were considering very important, and then going to something. That happens because unless there was a background, they won't connect with the new idea. Unless you have something in your mind, you won't be able to connect with a similar idea outside. So the connection happens in mutual concordance. When we have a lot of great spiritual tendencies in our mind, we will naturally look for similar things outside. So we connect. So if with an empty mind, that's why John Locke's theory, apparently it's all now practically discarded, not taken very seriously. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Swami.
Yeah.
Thank you. Shay, you're next.
Thank you, Swamiji. So my question here is a bit about this idea that the Upanishads are a source of proof for this concept of transmigration. I guess as someone who wasn't raised in the Indian tradition, like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, people might say, after you die, you go to heaven or hell. And you say, why do you believe that? And I'll say it was because it was in the Bible. And I guess for me, I always found that something to be skeptical of. And I feel that same skepticism here. Could you help me understand a little bit more?
Yeah. Could you have a very high opinion about a God? He gives you just one chance, or determine everything beforehand. Even if you try to be a good person, you have no chance to go to heaven because your verdict is already predetermined. So I don't want to question that view or anything. I don't know. I won't criticize. But this seems to be more logical because every day, every minute, you have an opportunity to start a new chapter in your life. Eternal damnation as a concept exists only in one of India's philosophical tradition. That in the doctrine of Madhvacharya, who was diametrically opposed to Shankaracharya's Advaita. Now he had the doctrine of Nitya Naraka Siddhanta, the doctrine of eternal damnation, something similar to it in Calvinistic theology. You find everything is predetermined, so you don't have a choice in that matter. Everything is already predetermined. Do you think? Of course, many of the questions, many of the criticism against God emerged out of this. The opposition from agnostic and atheist, and thinking of a God who is so cruel, who is so devoid of compassion that he gives only just one chance, and he decides everything beforehand. You have no choice to change your destiny. But Vedanta tells you that you can change your destiny anytime, anywhere. You mentioned, of course, this, I don't know how far I'm right, but I read somewhere that a large percentage of people in Western countries do believe in the incarnation. So they may not admit it openly, but they do believe. We don't know how far this is true. An article appeared long ago in the Time Weekly, which is at that time it was still publication. Maybe some of you must have read, and you can give your viewer more. You can throw more subject on this slide, more light on the subject. You can throw more light on the subject. Spoonerism, Professor Dr. Spooner. Okay, yeah.
Well, okay. I think probably a lot of people in the West do believe in reincarnation. I think it's like sometimes it's thrown around a bit casually, like, oh, I love dogs. I was a dog in my last life. It's very casual, right? But
it's ridiculous. That is absolutely. I think that is the impact of the gentleman who lived in California, who many mansions, life as a flow. What is his name? I forgot his name. He lived in California. He carried this reincarnation theory to an extreme level, which almost made him laughable. What is his name? I forgot his name.
have you said it before, Edgar Casey? Is this who you've said before? Okay.
Edgar Casey. That would be almost laughable. There is nothing laughable in this. It's just a view discussed in ancient scriptures. He says, suppose you go to him and you are ready to give him $5,000. He can make you are a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, and you would like to deny that that glorious heritage, inheritance, or you are perhaps a descendant of Henry VIII. Most of his very rich, his clients were, they were descendants of Alexander the Great, Henry VIII, and so on. So it became almost ridiculous. Please don't compare that with this. So very, yeah.
So I'm not comparing it, but I just, well, rather than saying like, okay, reincarnation seems like it's more logical or more benevolent than heaven or hell, I guess it feels to me that it's almost better to say we don't quite know what's going to happen, rather than saying I know it's going to happen because the Upanishads say it's going to happen.
For us in modern times, we can just think of this as an idea mentioned in ancient books. Of course, in Plato, you find hints of this, the law of karma and the doctrine of reincarnation. So that's a different matter. So anyway, the idea is that there's an invisible connecting link between what we think and what we do, and also between what we do and what happens to us later, not in a very tangible form, but in another form. So that is of course, Buddhism is built on the bedrock of transmigration, Praditya Samutpada, to a link chain. Buddha was very articulate in, Buddhism is very articulate in describing this. It's one of the vital teachings of Buddhism. In both Hinayana and Mahayana tradition, Praditya Samutpada, dependent origination, as I call it. So anyway, it is linked to this doctrine of rebirth and the doctrine of the law of karma. Otherwise, how do we explain? We have to think either God is not so very good after all, because he created a world which is not so very good, or he was very good, but he could not create a better one, so he was not so very powerful. So remember, I think many of these ideas must have existed even in some of the more ancient teachings of maybe Judaism, or because Judaism is much more ancient than Christianity. The doctrine of Christianity rejected this. If what I read is all right, in the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the division of the two church denominations. This is one view, which again, you can read Decline and Fall of Roman Empire. G mentions it's a different subject, of course. Gibbon.
Shay, I'm wondering if you want to, state your question again.
No, let's
Well,
give open some others. Wait
yes,
a minute.
yes. Others should ask.
Okay.
We can talk about this again and again. Others should ask. Thank
All
you.
right.
This cannot have an end, So anybody else wants to ask?
Yes, there are some questions. Let me explain. David has his hand up, but I was messaged by C. Gopinath that he actually had a non-responsive hand raise reaction. So C. Gopinath is next.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Bobby. Swamiji, as you mentioned, the Buddhists also believe in transmigration, and they actually take the idea further and have an elaborate system of identifying who the previous birth was and identifying the person who's been reborn and so on. Why didn't those practices come back into Hinduism? Is there a particular reason why that process was not prevalent among the Hindus?
Yeah, this doctrine of law of karma and reincarnation are not as important in Hinduism as they are in Buddhism. This is important because in Buddhism there is not a corresponding belief in a transcendental divine reality like God. So Buddhism puts much more emphasis on this Praditya Samutpada, dependent origination, this concept of law of karma and reincarnation, and then identifying, as choosing a new Dalai Lama. You have read about it in many books, perhaps. So classic examples. But Hinduism doesn't pay much attention, but it is a given Hindu belief system. I mean, they don't project as much as the Buddhists do, of course.
Thank you.
David, thank you for your patience. David Milstein.
David, please.
You're muted, David. Please unmute
Not
yourself.
not audible, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Bobby. Swami, I believe the argument as such, if it's an argument for reincarnation based on the kind of intuitive observations you've made, is compelling. Why does one child turn out differently than the other? Why in a group of children do some children have no compassion to animals or other people, and other children have an unalterable compassion for people? I come to this not from a particularly doctrinal point of view, because the holy texts say this, but from a more experiential point of view. So your argument resounds to me, and it arrives from, I don't have explanations for these things, so I would turn to something spiritual as an explanation, not something doctrinal, because I can't really explain it. And even on a personal level, as a child, I couldn't really explain why I felt different about things. And then as an adult, why I am attracted to a spiritual path, or Shay somehow ends up at this spiritual path, and yet thousands of other people don't. And so that sort of demands an answer. I posed this to somebody recently, and they said, well, those are just the cards you're dealt. That's random. It's DNA. It's just.
Can you repeat once more, repeat this. Please repeat this sentence.
I posed my argument, or my attraction towards the concept of reincarnation, or some variant of that, and to someone recently, intelligent, thoughtful person, and they looked skeptically at me and said, no, those are just things that you have. Those are the cards you are dealt, like in a card game. You happen to be dealt those things. Maybe it's your DNA. Maybe it's just random. But that was, to that person, a plausible explanation of all the differences you've talked about. And I wonder, what's your response to that?
Yeah, you can explain everything as some kind of an accident without a real explanation, without any precedent, without any logical connection. That is true. Everything can be explained. But this text presents a view which seems to be logical to many people. So from the agnostic point of view, when God doesn't exist, there is no question of anything other than this human body. And there's no connection between what we do and what we are going to suffer or enjoy in next life. There is absolutely no connection between our actions. And so that's true. Of course, that's also one view. In fact, in India, there are many schools of thought who believed that there is absolutely no such thing as doctrine of reincarnation or transmigration. They did believe only one body, one accidental manifestation of the body-mind complex. They're born in such a place. That's all. There is neither precedent nor antecedent. I mean, there is absolutely no connection. That view was common in India also. True, you're right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another danger of this view, David, is if you leave out all higher logical thinking, if you give up all our efforts to connect something with higher and transcendental, where is the place for higher music, mysticism, higher poetry? Why should we do good things? Why can't do bad things? By doing bad things, we can make a lot of profit. So, except the policeman's fear of punishment. So, the need for some higher transcendental ideal is very important. So okay, thank you. Just the idea came to me, so I mentioned. Thank you. Bobby, please continue.
I was wondering whether how you would view the resurrection story from Easter Sunday, which just passed, wherein Jesus gets a form of resurrection. Do you think does that represent the Christian world's hunger for some recognition of the transcendental or even of reincarnation?
True, true. In fact, as a non-baptized, non-Christian, as somebody who has read, made a study of Christianity, in our own informal, unconventional way, I see Jesus Christ as a great saint, very similar to our Vedic sages. And again, the very idea of resurrection would not have been conceived without some idea of going beyond death and still continuing to exist. So you die and still you continue to exist. You don't disappear altogether. So that idea must have been in the background behind this resurrection theory. No doctrine can emerge in a vacuum. If you study Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, every doctrine has some background, some explanation, some logical connection. Is it possible for the early Jews who were Christ followers, or Christ followers or Jews only? They were the products of Jewish tradition. So they must be familiar with this idea of dying and still continuing to exist, transcending death. So if you transcend death, then you have to accept that you are more than this physical body. Without that, you cannot think of. There were so many wounds on Christ's body, which all disappeared when he reappeared. So there is something in the background, the idea of going beyond death, going beyond the physical body, something continuing to exist even after death. Otherwise, resurrection theory cannot emerge in a vacuum. This is my understanding. You must be more familiar with this theological background. Okay.
David, I got your message. David would like to follow up with another question.
Yes, I think on the resurrection story, it's very interesting and fascinating that it is, although popularly they say, Christ has risen and has been reborn, there was no Jesus Christ guy walking around in Israel at this time. He died, his body died. And when they say resurrection, it really is a kind of a reincarnation theory that his spirit was not killed. But in a very literal sense, there is no Christian theology of which I'm familiar, which actually had Jesus's corporal body being alive. And therefore, it represents nothing more than the concept of that the soul, the spirit, the Atman cannot be killed. It cannot be destroyed. So I always found that interesting as a kind of a bridge to other theologies.
Yeah, true. And many of the accompanying doctrines must be the product of later generations. So especially after the establishment of the Catholic Church after Constantine's conversion, it's a different story. I mean, Christianity enters another phase of evolution after Constantine. But if you focus on Christ, the time when he lived, you're closer to something more profound. This is my view. Again, I may be superimposing the Hindu doctrine of reincarnation on the Abrahamic tradition. That's wrong. I should not do that. But remember, there is somewhere where you go beyond all these doctrinal differences. That's an interesting thing. So, at some point in our philosophical speculation, also spiritual evolution, we may transcend all doctrinal differences. Something that we feel, well, it cannot be otherwise. That strikes us mind. What do you say?
Yeah.
only possible explanation. So this is remember, this is a logical explanation of this, the whole dynamics of transmigration in the Brahma Sutra.
Well, I think we'll turn to the other David then.
Yeah, most well.
Swami, I just wanted to say that I think according to the most recent surveys, about 33% of Americans believe in reincarnation.
Yeah.
More young people than old people.
Yeah. So it could be true in Europe as well. In Europe also, perhaps.
Perhaps, yeah, I didn't.
Yeah.
I did have one other question related to that. Is in the
I can
story,
say something interesting in this, because that's why I'm interfering. Very interesting related to what you said. See, I'm coming from a state which is supposed to be, which is supposed to have seen the first emergence of a Christian community in India. Goes back to St. Thomas, if you believe the legend. At least the earliest churches in Kerala, where I'm coming from, go back to 3rd century AD. Now there is a group of Christians called Syrian Christians, who are the descendants of the early Christian community. A number of them came from Syria, maybe Israel, came to Kerala. That's what they believe, under the leadership of Saint Thomas. So the doubting Thomas, so to speak. So they are culturally Hindus. By faith, they are Christians. They often assert, most of them, that they are culturally Hindus. It may not be just the impact of the Hindu background in which they are living, but also it's possible that these Christians who might have arrived, who must have been the contemporaries of the early desert fathers, may represent a closer and maybe a more pure aspect of Christianity than what what happened in Rome, and where the Roman Empire played a very important role in the structure of Catholic Church. You have to remember that. So that did not happen to these early Christians. They must have come just a few decades after Christ's crucifixion. And so many of these disciples are still alive. So, and they have certain belief systems very close to Hinduism, especially the doctrine of reincarnation and rebirth. They may not write an article, but they do automatically believe in this. Maybe they represent an earlier version of Christianity closer to Jesus than the Christianity of Roman Empire, Constantine's Christianity. That's what I suppose. Please continue now. Sorry to interrupt. It's very closer to what you said just now. Please continue. Yeah.
Oh no, that's good, Swami. I if you want to interrupt,
No, please.
Well, just along that line, just quick aside, as I think most American atheists are used to arguing with Christians. I heard this, maybe it was even in here, but because most theologians, Christian theologians, are not very good at logic, but when they come across, like I remember Swami Ranganathananda would be so shockingly erudite and logical and able to argue his points that people would get flabbergasted by his, atheists are used to winning the argument so easily against theologians, and here was somebody they couldn't even touch. So that was always interesting. But my question was about King Bharata and how, even though he thought of as a deer at the end, I mean, that seems rather, it almost reminds me of Dr. Sarkar, who said, oh, you have to start over as a brickbat and keep circling around and around, get to, that how could somebody so exalted come back as a deer rather than just as a king again? He has to try again.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the sutra says, as a sutra, Tadantar Parivatu Ramgadi Samparishokta, which means accompanied by previous samskaras, previous impressions, previous tendencies, closely accompanied by the the previous samskaras. Very often, samskaras and impressions and tendencies coming from the latest of life cycles. Latest of life cycle. So, in Bharata's story, we find when he was dying, his mind had completely gone blank except the thought of the deer in front of him. So his whole mental world, antakarana, I mean thoughts, memories, speculation, everything was centered around the safety and security of a deer. So when he migrated, he had to live in that physical body. But he did not lose 1 ounce of his great tendencies, samskaras, impressions coming from him. He didn't lose anything. That's why the deer did not move out of the hermitage. He remained there without mixing with any other animal. He did not live like an animal. He stayed there without going away from there. And very shortly he died. And then, when he was living as a deer, he was thinking about his previous life. I was a king. I left my palace. I wanted to be an ascetic. I was meditating on the banks of the river. I was living the life of an ascetic. And then what happened to him? What happened to me? I was born as a deer. So he was panting and lamenting. So he was thinking of the ascetic life of previous life. So next life he was born as an ascetic. You can imagine. So, but he did not forget the problem that he faced in previous life. So he kept quiet. He won't speak to anyone. And finally, he opened his mind only. One day he was walking. His brothers drove him away because they thought he's so dull. So they took away all the properties of the father's death. His brothers took away all his properties and drove him away. This man, pretending to be totally unconcerned about anything, he was walking, but he was a healthy man. So King Rahugana was traveling in a palanquin. They wanted somebody to carry the palanquin, some kind of, the bear. So they wanted one bearer. So they called him. He came, okay, fine. He began to carry the palanquin, but he didn't care for the rules, steady steps, everything. So it began to shake. The king found his palanquin was not properly carried. It was shaking. He felt disturbed. He came out. You fellow, why don't you carry the palanquin properly? Why don't you behave like that? Then this man who was pretending to be dull and mute, he said, who is carrying whom? What's the difference between you and me? You are in this physical body. I'm in this body. Who is carrying whom? We are both Atman. You are this physical body of a king. I have the body of this humble palanquin bearer. The king opened his eyes. What's the matter? They had a long discussion on the highest Vedanta. This dialogue between this palanquin bearer, Jadabharata, and this king. It's a very interesting part of the entire text. Then the king prostrated before him and told others to respect him, to recognize him. He was a great sage and saint. This is how the story goes. So what I mean to say, but these stories do have a great value, respect for higher values, renunciation, asceticism, and all that. If you can teach children, for example, how a humble palanquin bearer taught higher philosophy to a king, you can imagine. There are great, wonderful ideas, the charm, and just like many of the parables of the Old Testament or New Testament, very great teachings. Buddha's Jataka tales. Thank you. So I think we have had a wonderful discussion. Thank you for everyone for joining this discussion. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tatsat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.